The night Deputy Roy Talbert walked into the healing harbor
See
and
this
put his boot
badge?
through the
I can do
memorial
whatever I
display
want.
case.
You
He
can't
believed
just
he was
destroy this
untouchable.
place.
He believed a bar full of nurses and one gray-haired bartender were the easiest targets he'd ever chosen. He was wrong about all of it. By 4 in the morning, 50 Navy SEALs had surrounded the Delaware County Sheriff's Station in complete silence, and the badge Roy Talbert had used as a weapon for 11 years was about to become the thing that buried him. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody except the old man behind the bar who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. If this story already has you leaning forward, I want you to stay with me all the way to the end. Because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about quiet people. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain started around 8 that evening, which was earlier than the forecast predicted, and heavier than anyone in Delwick had dressed for. It came in sideways off the ridge, the kind of rain that found gaps in window frames and turned the gutters into small rivers. And by the time Megan Holloway had the bar fully open and the lights above the memorial wall switched on, the street outside was already empty. She didn't mind the empty street. Tuesday nights at the Healing Harbor were rarely loud, and she had learned over 3 years of running the place that the value of a quiet night wasn't nothing. You counted your stock, you wiped down the good glasses, you made sure the coffee station near the back was clean, because the nurses who came in after double shifts never ordered alcohol first. They ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth and let the noise leave their bodies slowly, the way heat leaves a cooling engine. Megan was 37 years old and had the particular kind of tiredness that didn't come from bad sleep. It came from a decade of emergency room nursing before she left the hospital system and poured everything she had into this building. She was compact and precise in her movements, the kind of person who never knocked things over and always knew where her keys were. She wore her dark hair pulled back and kept the bar apron tied tight because she hated anything loose near the equipment. Her staff called her Meg. Roy Talbert, when he came in, called her nothing at all, just pointed. Ethan Cole was already behind the bar when she arrived at 6:30. He was always early. He had been working at the Healing Harbor since before Megan took over, a fact the previous owner had mentioned almost as a warning. Ethan comes with the building, the man had said. You'll want to keep him. She had kept him, and she had never once regretted it, though there were moments, small accumulating moments, when she sensed there was more to the man than she had been allowed to see. He was 61, maybe 62, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and the kind of stillness in his face that wasn't vacancy but something more deliberate. He moved behind the bar the way surgeons moved in operating theaters, economically, without wasted gesture, and when things went wrong, a drunk getting loud, a spilled tray, a delivery showing up 3 hours late, he handled it without his expression changing. He had a scar along his left forearm that he never explained and a habit of positioning himself near the door at closing time, which Megan had initially thought was an old man's anxious routine before she realized it was something else entirely. She didn't know what to call it. She had stopped trying to name it. The first customers came in around 7:15, a pair of surgical nurses from Hartwell Regional who Megan recognized by their faces, even though she'd never learned their names. They ordered coffee and the vegetable soup that Ethan kept warm in the back, and they sat near the window and talked in the low, exhausted way that people talk when they've been holding themselves together for 12 hours and can finally let a little of it out. 3 veterans came in at 8, 2 men and a woman, all of them from the Fort Lassiter demobilization group that met on Tuesday evenings at the community center 2 blocks away. They were regulars. They sat at the bar and Ethan brought them their drinks without being asked, and asked the woman about her daughter's school situation without prompting, which Megan noticed because she hadn't known the woman had a daughter, let alone that the school situation was something worth asking about. That was another thing about Ethan. He remembered everything people told him and nothing that people hadn't. By 9 o'clock, the rain was heavier and the bar had filled to about half capacity, which was a decent Tuesday. Megan was doing the week's orders at the corner table when the door opened and Roy Talbert walked in without knocking, which wasn't unusual because nobody knocked at a bar, but the way he entered was different from the way customers entered. He opened the door with his shoulder, not his hand, and he stood in the entrance for a moment longer than he needed to, making sure the room had time to register him. He was 44, built like someone who had played competitive sports in his 20s and gained weight in the wrong way afterward, the bulk of him settling in his middle without losing the broad shoulders. He wore his deputy's uniform, though he was officially off duty, which Megan had come to understand was a costume choice. The badge and the belt said things Roy Talbert wanted said before he opened his mouth. He had two men with him, both in civilian clothes, both the kind of men who stood with their feet slightly too wide apart. Megan didn't know their names. She had seen them twice before, once in the parking lot of the Food Plus 3 weeks ago, and once parked outside the Healing Harbor in an unmarked truck on a Thursday afternoon, just sitting there, the engine running, until she had finally called Ethan out to look, and they had driven away. Talbert walked to the bar and dropped his forearm on the surface and looked at Ethan with the particular expression he used on people he considered beneath him, which was most people. "Quiet night," Talbert said. Ethan looked at him. "Can I get you something?" "I'm not here for a drink." He looked around the room slowly, letting his gaze touch the customers, making sure they felt it. Most of them looked at their glasses. The surgical nurses near the window stopped talking. "I'm here because you've got a permit issue, Cole. Your outdoor signage doesn't comply with the county lighting ordinance revised last month." "We don't have outdoor signage," Ethan said. "You've got a light above the door." "That's a safety light. It's required by fire code." Talbert smiled without warmth. "That's interesting. I've got paperwork that says different." Megan closed her order book and stood up. She was aware of the room shifting slightly, people recalibrating, the veterans at the bar turning their heads just enough without appearing to look. She walked to the bar and stood beside Ethan and looked at Talbert directly. "Roy," she said, "we've passed every inspection this building has had in 3 years." He moved his gaze to her slowly, like a man adjusting a telescope. "That's Deputy Talbert. What do you actually want tonight?" The smile didn't change. "I want compliance. I want businesses in this county to understand that the county's guidelines exist for a reason and that ignoring them has consequences." He pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket and set it on the bar. "You've got 14 days to bring the exterior into compliance. If you can't do that, the county has discretion on license renewals." Megan looked at the paper without picking it up. She had received 4 of these in the past 5 months, each citing a different violation, each coming within a week of a conversation in which Talbert had suggested obliquely that businesses who supported community initiatives, his word, tended to have fewer paperwork issues. He had never been explicit enough to constitute a threat she could record and report cleanly. He was too experienced for that. She picked up the paper, folded it again the way he had folded it, and handed it back to him. "We'll have our attorney review it," she said. His expression shifted slightly, just enough to notice. One of the men behind him made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your attorney," Talbert said. "Yes." He left the paper on the bar and straightened and looked around the room one more time. Then he turned and walked out, his 2 men behind him, the door swinging shut in the wet air. The room held its silence for a few seconds. Then one of the veterans at the bar, a heavy-set man named Doran Wyas, said quietly, "You need to be more careful with that one, Meg." "I know," she said. "I don't think you do." He wasn't being unkind, he was being precise. Talbert doesn't take no from women. He especially doesn't take no from women who run places like this. She understood what he meant by places like this. He meant places that didn't belong to him. Ethan had not moved or changed expression during any of it. He began wiping the bar with a clean cloth, working in the same slow circles he always worked in, and when the conversation around them resumed, he said quietly, without looking up, "He'll be back." "I know that too," Megan said. "When he comes back, it'll be different." She looked at Ethan. "Different how?" He folded the cloth and set it aside and looked at her directly for the first time that evening. His eyes were a very pale gray, which she had never fully gotten used to. "He'll want an answer he can use," Ethan said. "Not paperwork, an answer." She thought about what that meant for the rest of the night. Talbert came back 11 days later, and Ethan was right that it was different. It was a Friday, which meant the bar was near capacity. The Healing Harbor did its best business on Friday evenings. When the week's worth of hospital and clinic workers came in together, filling the booths and the bar stools, the volume rising with each hour as the tension that had accumulated over 5 working days finally found somewhere to go. Megan had 3 staff working, and the kitchen was running orders and the memorial wall. The framed photos and names and unit patches of medical workers and veterans who had died in service was lit with the small warm light she kept on every night without exception. Talbert arrived at 9:47. He didn't come alone this time. He had 4 men, all in civilian clothes, and they were not the careful, quiet type who stood in parking lots. These were louder, bigger, and they spread through the entrance in a way that forced customers to step back without anyone being technically pushed. Megan was behind the bar. She saw Talbert's eyes move through the room and land on the memorial wall, and something in his expression told her he had thought about this visit beforehand, had selected the target. He walked directly to the display case below the memorial wall, a glass-fronted cabinet that held a folded flag, 3 service medals, and a photograph of a surgical team taken somewhere overseas that Megan didn't know the name of. It had been there since before she bought the bar, and she had never moved it. Talbert stopped in front of it and looked at it for a moment the way people look at things they intend to damage. "Megan," he said, loud enough for the room, "we need to talk about the terms of your continued operation." The bar had gone quiet. Not immediately, but in the way a fire goes out, section by section, until there's nothing left. Megan came out from behind the bar. "Not here," she said. "If you want a business conversation, you can make an appointment during—" "I don't make appointments." He turned from the display case to face her. "You've been a problem for this county for 3 years. You and your little memorial bar, and your nurses, and your—" He gestured vaguely at the wall. "Your decorations. I've been patient." "Deputy Talbert." Her voice was steady. She was aware of 60 people watching. "You need to leave." "What I need," he said, "is for you to sign the operating agreement I've had drawn up. It formalizes the arrangement between the Healing Harbor and the county's business improvement initiative." She knew what the agreement was. One of the other business owners, a man named Percival, who ran the auto repair shop on Grover Street, had been shown the same document 2 months ago. It granted Talbert's group access to business premises for storage and transit purposes, in language vague enough to mean almost anything, in exchange for relief from county compliance pressure. Percival had signed it. He had stopped sleeping well afterward. "I'm not signing anything," she said. The room was completely silent now. Talbert's face went through a short transformation she had not seen before. The careful, practiced civility dropped, and what was underneath was neither anger nor contempt exactly. It was something more practical than that, the expression of a man deciding that the time for implication was finished. He turned to the display case and kicked it. The glass front shattered in one clean movement, the cabinet rocking back against the wall, the flag and medals tumbling forward. Someone in the room made a sound, not a scream, something more involuntary, like an exhale at impact. Megan felt her whole body go rigid. Talbert reached into the broken case and took out the photograph. "This is private property," she said. The steadiness in her voice surprised her. "It's a bar," he said. "Licensed by the county." He held up the photograph. "You know what your problem is? You think this kind of thing makes you untouchable. Service record, military connections, community respect." He shook his head. "It doesn't. The only thing that makes you untouchable in Delwick County is me." He set the photograph down on the floor, not thrown, deliberately placed, which was somehow worse. "Sign the agreement," he said, "or by next week you won't have a license left to argue about." Megan looked at him. Then she looked at the photograph on the floor. Then she looked at the room full of people who had come here to decompress after hard weeks of work, who were now sitting very still, some of them with their hands flat on the table in a posture she recognized as suppressed shock. She did not sign. She said, "Get out of my bar." Talbert looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked past her at Ethan Cole, who had not moved from his position behind the bar and had not changed his expression and was watching Talbert with the pale gray eyes that gave nothing away. "You should talk to your employee," Talbert said. "Old men who think they're still relevant make bad decisions." Ethan said nothing. One of Talbert's men picked up a bar stool and set it down in the middle of the walkway, blocking the path to the door. Not violently. Just there, as a statement of inconvenience, of small territorial control. Then they left, all 5 of them, unhurried, through the crowd that parted for them without being asked. The door closed. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Doran Weiss got up from his stool and walked to the display case and crouched down and began carefully collecting the medals from the floor. One of the surgical nurses came from her booth and joined him. Megan stood where she was and breathed. Ethan came around the bar and walked to where the photograph lay and picked it up and held it with both hands for a moment, looking at it, and then he set it on the nearest table, face up, carefully and looked at Megan. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "Sit down for a minute, Meg." She sat. He sat across from her. The noise in the bar had resumed, not to its previous level, but enough that they had a kind of privacy. "You knew this was coming," she said. "I knew something like it." "How bad does this get?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she had learned the difference, but genuinely measuring. "He's done this before," Ethan said. "Businesses that sign his agreement don't get left alone. They get used, and then they get discarded, and the liability stays with them, not with him. The ones who refuse get pressure escalated until either they close or they capitulate. There's a third option, but it requires resources he doesn't think you have." "What's the third option?" "Evidence," he said. "Enough of it, organized correctly, given to the right people." She looked at him. "Do you know who the right people are?" He looked back at her. "I know some." This was the closest he had come in 3 years to telling her something about himself, and she understood that it was as close as he intended to come, and she decided it was enough for now. "What do I do tomorrow?" she said. "Tomorrow you open the bar," he said. "Keep records of every interaction with him, every visit, every demand, every document he gives you. Date, time, exact words if you can remember them." "And tonight?" "Tonight," Ethan said, "we fixed the display case." They fixed the display case that night. Ethan and Doran and 2 of the veterans and one of the surgical nurses, whose name turned out to be Priya and who turned out to have a remarkably efficient approach to repairing broken wood frames. It took 2 hours. The glass couldn't be replaced until morning, so Ethan rigged a piece of plywood cut from a storage panel behind the cabinet, and by midnight the memorial wall looked almost as it had before. The flag refolded, the medals back in position, the photograph rehung with fresh tape at the corners. Megan watched him work and thought about what he'd said. "I know some," and thought about the way he had looked at Talbert's face, not with fear or anger, but with something that looked like recognition, like he was reading a familiar document. She had asked him once, early on, about his background, the polite and elliptical way people ask when they're uncertain how far to push. He'd said he'd done some medical work in the service. She'd asked what branch. He said Navy. She'd asked what kind of medical work. He said he'd tell her when it became relevant. She was starting to think it might be becoming relevant. The last customer left at 12:30. Priya stayed to help close, which she did efficiently and without being asked twice about anything. When everything was wiped and stacked and the locks were checked, Megan stood at the bar in the quiet and looked at the memorial wall and felt something she couldn't fully name, a compound of anger and grief and something else beneath both of them, something that wanted to move. Ethan was counting the till in the back. She went to the back and stood in the doorway and said, "Ethan, he's going to come back with more." "Yes," Ethan said, not looking up from the cash. "We can't keep doing what we did tonight. We can't just fix the case and open the next day and keep taking it." He finished counting and closed the till and looked at her. "I know." "So what happens next?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you still have the card I gave you? The emergency contact, the one I told you to put somewhere safe and only use if there was no other choice?" She stared at him. He had given her that card 18 months ago, on a night she no longer fully remembered the context of, sliding it across the bar after closing and saying, in the same measured tone he used for everything, "Put this somewhere you don't lose things. Don't use it unless you have to." "Yes," she said. "I have it." "Good." "Ethan, who is on that card?" He picked up his jacket from the hook by the back door and shrugged it on and said, "Someone I used to work with." "In the Navy?" "Yes." "What kind of did you actually do?" She wasn't asking politely anymore. "Not the medical work, the other work. Because a Navy medic doesn't hand out emergency contact cards like that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Keep the card safe," he said. "If Talbert escalates, if he does something that takes it past harassment into something that looks like it can't be resolved through normal channels, use it." "And if I use it, what happens?" Ethan picked up his keys and looked at her once more, and in that moment his face did something she had never seen it do before. Not a smile. Something older and quieter than a smile. "Then," he said, "the right people will know where to look." He left. She stood in the back room of the healing harbor, listening to the rain, which had started again, and thought about what it meant that the quietest man she had ever employed had given her a phone number and told her it could change everything. She didn't know yet what Ethan Cole had done before he became a bartender. She didn't know yet what that card would set in motion, but Roy Talbert came back 2 weeks later with 7 men and an official county closure notice and a particular kind of confidence that belonged to people who had never, not once in their lives, miscalculated the person standing in front of them. He walked into the Healing Harbor at 10:15 on a Thursday night, when the bar was full, when the lights above the memorial wall were on, when Ethan Cole was standing exactly where he always stood, behind the bar, near the door. And this time, Ethan Cole looked at Roy Talbert and said, quietly, so that only Talbert could hear it clearly, "You picked the wrong people to underestimate." Talbert laughed. He held up the closure notice. He said, "Old man, I've got the authority of Delaware County behind me. What have you got?" Ethan reached under the bar and set down a small glass of water, which was what he always did when the conversation required clarity. "I've got a phone call that was made 45 minutes ago," he said, "and I've got patience." Talbert had started to respond when his radio crackled. He reached for it with the automatic reflex of long habit. Listened. His face changed. He listened again. He looked at Ethan Cole with an expression that had, for the first time since Megan had known him, something unfamiliar moving through it. Something that looked, almost precisely, like the beginning of understanding. The radio message was short. Megan caught only fragments of it from where she stood. Federal jurisdiction, and stand down, and something about a field office authorization that she didn't have the context to interpret. But she watched Roy Talbert's face while he listened, and that was enough. The confidence left him incrementally, the way air leaves a tire, not all at once but steadily, the shape of him changing without any single dramatic moment. His jaw tightened, his hand came up and pressed the radio closer to his ear, as if proximity would change what he was hearing. Then the transmission ended, and he lowered the radio and stood very still in the middle of the Healing Harbor, with 7 men behind him, and a closure notice in his hand and an expression that was working hard to stay composed. The room was watching, 60 people, none of them moving. Talbert looked at Ethan Cole. Ethan looked back at him with the same expression he had worn all evening, which was no expression at all. "What did you do?" Talbert said. It wasn't a question. "I made a phone call," Ethan said. "Like I told you. You don't have that kind of reach." His voice had dropped, which Megan understood was not calm, but the opposite of calm. It was the voice of a man speaking quietly, because speaking loudly would expose something. "You're a bartender. You've been a bartender for 15 years. 12, Ethan said. "And before that, I was something else." Talbert stared at him. Then he looked at Megan, and she had the distinct sensation that he was recalibrating, that the calculation he had run on her and on this building and on the people in it was producing a different answer than it had a minute ago, and that he didn't like the answer. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Ethan said. Talbert folded the closure notice and put it in his jacket pocket and turned and walked out. His 7 men followed, more quickly than they'd entered, and the door swung shut behind them, and for the second time in 2 weeks the room held its silence and then let it go. Doran Wise, still at the bar, exhaled loud enough to hear. Megan walked to Ethan. She kept her voice low. "What just happened?" He got a call from the county sheriff telling him to stand down pending a federal review of county licensing procedures. "How did that happen in 45 minutes? Ethan picked up a glass and began drying it. "I made a call before my shift. I had a feeling about tonight." She stared at him. "You had a feeling." He'd been escalating on a schedule. 2 weeks between each move. The closure notice fit the timeline. "Ethan, who did you call?" He set the glass down and looked at her and said, "Someone who owes me a significant favor and has the authority to make county sheriffs listen." She waited. He didn't continue. "That's all you're going to give me," she said. "For tonight," he said. "Yes." She wanted to push harder and she knew it wouldn't produce anything, so she didn't. She went back to work because the bar was still full and the customers needed to feel that things were normal, or as close to normal as the last hour permitted. And projecting normalcy was something she was good at from the hospital years. When you learned quickly that your face was information and that people in vulnerable positions read it constantly. By midnight, the bar had emptied and the staff had cleaned, and Priya, who had become a semi-regular presence at closing after the first incident, sat at the bar with a cup of coffee and said, He's going to come back harder. Yes, Megan said. He's going to feel embarrassed. Men like that don't process embarrassment well. I know. So what's the plan? Megan looked at Ethan, who was restocking the refrigerator under the bar and not appearing to listen, which she now understood meant he was listening to every word. We're building a case, she said. Records of every contact he's made, every citation, every visit, every demand. Priya wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. You know, 2 of the businesses on Grover Street closed last year, right? Talbert came for them the same way. First the violations, then the agreement, then when they signed. They were gone within 8 months, both of them. Megan hadn't known that. What happened to them? Officially, market conditions? Priya's voice was dry. One of the owners moved to Mill Haven. The other one just, I don't know, disappeared from the conversation. She paused. There's a woman named Gracia Odom. She runs a home care agency on Fenwick Road. Talbert went after her 18 months ago, and she fought back. And then 3 of her employees had their credentials audited by the county in the same month, and 2 of them lost their certifications temporarily over paperwork technicalities. She looked at Megan. He doesn't just come at you. He comes at the people around you. The refrigerator door closed. Ethan straightened up. That's useful, he said. Do you know Gracia Odom personally? Priya looked at him. We went through orientation together at Hartwell 10 years ago. Why? Because if she'll talk on record, her experience plus ours plus the other businesses forms a pattern. A pattern is evidence of a system, not an incident. Systems are what investigators look for. Priya was quiet for a moment. She's not going to want to. She's been keeping her head down since it happened. I know, Ethan said, but if she hears there's a structure forming, that she won't be the only one standing in front of it, that might change her calculation. Megan looked at him. You've thought about this before tonight. He looked back at her with the pale eyes. I've thought about it since the second time he came in. The week that followed was its own kind of education. Megan kept the bar open every night and kept her face even and greeted the regulars the same way she always had. And behind that surface, she was building the file that Ethan had described. She wrote down every interaction she could recall going back 14 months, dates and exact wording where she had it, approximate language where she didn't, and she photographed every citation document and violation notice and stored them separately from the bar's general files. Priya reached out to Gracia Odom on a Wednesday. Gracia said she needed to think about it. On Friday, she called Priya back and said she'd made an appointment to talk to a lawyer in Mill Haven, outside Delwick County, which Priya relayed to Megan as a cautious maybe. Megan added it to the file. 3 other business owners on Grover Street and Fenwick Road contacted her in that same week, 2 of them by phone and 1 in person. A man named Tiberius Lark, who ran a pharmacy and walked in on a Sunday afternoon without calling ahead, and sat at the bar during the quiet afternoon hours, and told Megan that Talbert had approached him 4 months ago and that he had signed the operating agreement because he had a wife with a complicated medical situation and couldn't afford a license problem, and that he was living with what he'd done every day. Megan listened to all of it. She wrote it down. She gave Lark Ethan's assessment, the pattern argument, the investigator logic. And he nodded slowly and said he'd think about whether he could add his name to anything official. Ethan spent 3 of those evenings in the back office after close, which she had never seen him do before. She didn't ask what he was doing. When she came in on Thursday morning to do inventory, she found a handwritten list on her desk, 7 names and organizations, with phone numbers beside each. And at the bottom, a single line in Ethan's even, cramped handwriting, when the time comes. She left the list where it was. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until much later, was that Ethan had also been making calls during those evenings, not to the contact who had produced the federal review, but to others, older, more specific, the kind of calls that went through multiple steps before they reached the right person. He was not panicking. He was doing what he had learned to do in conditions where panic was a liability, building the scaffolding, methodically, in the correct sequence, without any of the people around him needing to know the weight of what he was constructing. The trouble with that kind of preparation was that it required time, and Roy Talbert had decided he was done giving it. He came back on a Saturday night, and this time he didn't bring a closure notice. He brought 12 men and a set of what he called county inspectors, 4 of them with clipboards and county identification badges, and he arrived at 8:30 when the bar was at its fullest. The Friday-level energy carried over into the weekend, every booth taken, and the bar 3 people deep. Megan saw the headlights of the vehicles through the front window first. She had been watching for them, some part of her always watching. But the number of people who climbed out was more than she'd prepared for, and she felt her chest do something involuntary before she straightened it out. Ethan was behind the bar. She caught his eye. He had already seen. Talbert came through the door first, and this time there was no performance of civility at all. He crossed to the center of the room and held up his badge and said, loud enough for everyone, "County inspection. All patrons are requested to exit the premises in an orderly manner." Nobody moved. The room had that particular suspension that happens when 60 people simultaneously decide whether to believe what they've just heard. One of the inspectors began walking toward the kitchen. Megan stepped in front of him. "You need a warrant or a valid inspection notice to access the kitchen," she said. "Do you have either?" He looked at Talbert. Talbert said, "The inspection notice is in process. Stand aside." "That's not how inspection procedures work in this county," Megan said. She knew this because she had spent one of the evenings that week reading the county's own municipal code online, all 87 pages of it, with a highlighter. Section 14 requires written notice 48 hours in advance, except in cases of reported immediate health risk. What's the reported health risk? Talbert stared at her. "You want to do this in front of your customers?" "You started it in front of my customers." The room still hadn't moved. A few people had their phones out, which Megan noted with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. Cameras change things, sometimes for better and sometimes not. Talbert shifted his weight and looked past her at the bar, at Ethan, and then at the room full of people, and she could see him doing the calculation she'd watched him do before, except this time something in the calculation was sticking. He walked to her and lowered his voice. "You think a federal review protects you. It doesn't. That's a procedural delay, not a resolution, and procedural delays run out." He was close enough that she could see the capillaries in his nose. "Sign the agreement, and this ends tonight. The inspection gets canceled, the review gets resolved in your favor, you stay open. That's the deal." She looked at him steadily. "No." "Meg." He had never called her that before. The familiarity was a specific kind of threat. "I'm trying to give you a way through this." "You're trying to get what you came for. I'm saying no." He held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, and then he stepped back and looked at the room and said, loud again, "Clear the premises. Inspection is proceeding." And then Ethan Cole came around the bar. He didn't move fast. He moved the way he always moved, deliberately, without wasted motion. But something about him was different in a way that the room registered before anyone could articulate it. He walked past Megan and stopped 2 feet from Talbert and looked at him. I was not a large man. He was not young. He had gray hair and a lined face and a bartender's apron. But Roy Talbert, who had not backed down from anyone in 11 years of abusing his badge, took 1/2 step backward without appearing to notice he'd done it. "The inspection is not proceeding," Ethan said. His voice was the same voice he used to tell customers the kitchen was closing. Level. Final. "These premises are currently under the documentation protocols of a federal anti-corruption review. Any interference with business operations during a federal review constitutes obstruction. That applies to county officials." Talbert recovered fast. "You don't have standing to—" "I'm not asserting standing," Ethan said. "I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your choice." One of the fake inspectors said something to Talbert in a low voice. Talbert listened without looking at him. "You're bluffing," Talbert said. "Maybe," Ethan said. The word landed in the silence and sat there. The problem with maybe was that it wasn't a denial. And Talbert was experienced enough, corrupt enough, to know that the people who were most dangerous to him were not the ones who threatened him explicitly, but the ones who declined to, who stood in the center of a room full of witnesses and said, maybe with absolute stillness, and let him make the next move. Talbert looked at the room. 60 people, at least a dozen with phones visible. He made the calculation. "We'll be back," he said. "I know," Ethan said. They left. All 14 of them, the inspectors tripping slightly over each other near the door, Talbert last, and when the final vehicle pulled out of the lot, the room exhaled collectively. And then someone, Megan thought it was Doran, but she wasn't sure, started clapping, slow at first, then others joining, and she wanted to tell them not to because it wasn't over and celebration was premature, but she understood the impulse, so she let it run for a moment before she held up a hand. "Drinks on me for the next 30 minutes, she said. Then I need everybody calm. The cheer that followed was real, and she let herself have 1 second of it before she turned to Ethan and said quietly, "Was that true? The Federal Review obstruction thing?" "The review is real," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "The obstruction clause is technically accurate under the right jurisdictional framing. The question is whether it would hold in court." "And would it?" "Probably not immediately," he said. "But it would take time to challenge, and time is what we need." She thought about that. "You were buying time." "I was buying 2 or 3 days," he said. "Maybe 4. "For what?" He untied his apron and folded it and set it on the bar. For the first time that evening, he looked tired. Not old tired, but the kind of tired that comes from sustained concentration, from holding something together through force of attention. "Ethan." She said his name the way she had never said it before, the way you say a name when what you mean is, "I need you to tell me the truth." 4 days for what? He looked at her. Then he looked at the memorial wall, the repaired case, the photograph that Priya had reframed with a better frame than the original after the first incident. "I've been in contact with someone at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service," he said. "Not directly. Through someone who knows someone. The documentation we have, the citations, Lark's testimony, the pattern across businesses. It's enough to open a formal inquiry. But formal inquiries need a triggering event. An incident significant enough that a county-level corruption case justifies federal resources." "He just sent fake inspectors into a bar full of people," Megan said. "It's not enough, not by itself." He paused. "But Talbert is going to escalate again. Whatever he does next will be bigger, and if we're ready for it, if the right people are watching when he does it, that's the triggering event." She stared at him. "You're using us as bait." He met her eyes. "I'm using the situation that already exists." "Ethan, he was going to escalate regardless," he said quietly, but with an edge under the quiet that she hadn't heard before. "I didn't create this. I'm trying to make sure that when he makes his next move, it destroys him instead of you." She sat with that for a moment. "You've done this before," she said. Not a question. "This kind of setting something up so the target reveals himself. You've run this before." He was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the rain had started again, the second time this week, which felt like the weather had taken a position. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. "I need you to keep the bar open and keep the records and stay visible. And I need you to tell me immediately if he contacts you directly. Phone, message, anything." "And the card?" He looked at her. "The emergency contact," she said. "Do I use it yet?" He shook his head. "Not yet. That's the last option. When there's nothing left to try, you use it." "What happens when I use it?" He picked up his jacket from the hook and looked at her once more. "That call," he said, "doesn't bring one person. It brings a response." She was still turning that word over, response, when her phone buzzed on the bar. She picked it up. Unknown number. She answered. The voice on the other end was Roy Talbert's, and he was not performing anymore. The measured threat was gone. What she heard instead was the voice of a man who had moved past strategy into something rawer and more dangerous. "You've got until Monday," he said. "After that, I stop asking." The line went dead. She set the phone down. Ethan was watching her. "Monday," she said. He nodded once, slowly, and something shifted in his pale eyes. Not alarm, but focus. The kind of focus that had its own particular weight to it. And for the first time, Megan Holloway understood that the quiet man who had worked behind her bar for 3 years and dried glasses in slow circles, and remembered everyone's name and said almost nothing about his own life had been, once, something that a phone call to the right number could still activate, something that Talbert had no framework for and no defense against. She also understood, standing in the empty bar with the rain coming down outside, that Monday was 4 days away and that whatever Ethan Cole was building had to be ready by then, because Roy Talbert's voice had told her, with perfect clarity, that he had already decided what happened if it wasn't. What she didn't know was that Talbert had made his own call that same night, to a man named Burkett, who handled problems that couldn't be handled through official channels, and that Burkett had said he could have 3 men in Delwick by Sunday morning, and that Talbert had said make it 4. Sunday came in cold and clear, which was worse than rain. Rain gave you cover. Clear skies meant visibility in every direction, and visibility at the wrong moment was something Ethan Cole had spent the better part of 2 decades learning to manage. He was up before 5, which was not unusual, sitting at the small table in his apartment on Crestline Road with a cup of coffee and a notepad, and the kind of focused stillness that looked from the outside like a man doing nothing at all. He was doing several things. The first was running the timeline. Talbert had said Monday. Burkett, whose name Ethan had learned through the same network of contacts he'd been carefully not explaining to Megan, operated on compressed schedules because compressed schedules were harder to document. If Burkett had 4 men coming into Delwick, they were already here, or would be by noon. They wouldn't act during daylight on Sunday. Too visible, too many church traffic witnesses on the county routes. Sunday evening was the window, or Monday before the bar opened. The second thing he was doing was listening to himself, the internal assessment that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with accuracy. He was 61 years old. His left knee had a hardware repair from a 2003 insertion that gave him trouble in cold weather, and this morning it was giving him trouble. His reaction time was not what it had been at 35 or 40 or even 50, and he knew it with the same clarity he knew his own pulse rate. I was not going to win a physical confrontation with 4 men by being fast. He had never needed to be fast. He had always needed to be right. The third thing he was doing was writing a letter, which he had been composing in his head for 2 days and was now committing to paper. It was addressed to Megan. He folded it when he was finished and put it in an envelope and left it on his kitchen table with her name on the front, and then he picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first call lasted 4 minutes. The second call lasted 90 seconds. The third call lasted 11 minutes, and when it ended, he sat for a moment with the phone on the table and drank the rest of his cold coffee and thought about a village in a country he was not permitted to name in official documents, and a decision he had made there that he still believed was correct, and the cost of correct decisions, which was not always what you expected when you made them. He put his jacket on and drove to the healing harbor. Megan had not slept more than 3 hours. She knew because she had watched the clock at 2:15 and again at 4:40, and then given up and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the documentation file open in front of her, not reading it, just needing it visible. She was at the bar by 7, which was 2 hours before any staff arrived, and she used the time to do what she always did when she needed to think. She cleaned. Not because anything was dirty, but because her hands needed to be busy, and cleaning had a logic that didn't require the front of her brain, which freed the back of it to work. She was wiping down the shelves behind the bar when she heard Ethan's key in the back door. She had given him a key 3 years ago because he was always first in, and it had never occurred to her to question it. But now, hearing it this morning, she thought about what it meant that she had trusted a man with that kind of access before she knew anything real about him. She thought about it, and then she put it down. Because the truth was that 3 years of small, consistent evidence had told her everything she needed to know about whether Ethan Cole was safe to trust, and she had chosen to believe the evidence instead of the mystery. She still believed it. He came through to the bar and she handed him a coffee without being asked, and he sat on the customer side of the bar, which he almost never did, and wrapped both hands around the cup. "They're here," he said. She set her cloth down. "Burkett's people. One of them had breakfast at the Fenwick Diner an hour ago. Paid cash." He paused. "It's not definitive, but the timing is consistent." "What do we do?" He looked at the coffee. "I need you to call your staff and tell them not to come in today." She stared at him. "Ethan, it's Sunday. We have reservations." "I know. Cancel them. Tell them there's a plumbing issue. Whatever you need to say." She started to argue and then stopped, because the expression on his face was not the careful, neutral expression he wore 90% of the time. There was something under the surface of it that she didn't have a name for, but that her body recognized at a frequency below language. "Okay," she said. "I need the bar empty except for you and me." "And then what?" "And then we wait and see what they decide to do, and we're ready for it." She made the calls. She hated the calls. She hated lying to her staff, and she hated the sound of their voices accepting the plumbing story with the cheerful resignation of part-time workers who had learned not to ask follow-up questions. She texted the reservation holders personally with an apology and a voucher for next weekend and told herself she would make it right. When she was done, she set the phone on the bar and looked at Ethan and said, "Tell me what I need to know." He considered this for a moment, which she had learned meant he was deciding not how much to tell her, but in what order. Burkett's people are not sheriff's deputies, he said. They're independent contractors. Talbert uses them when he wants something done that he can't run through official channels. The history I've been able to confirm involves two incidents. One where a business owner's vehicle was vandalized extensively enough to force a temporary closure, and one where a credible witness against Talbert in a county licensing dispute was hospitalized after what was reported as a mugging. She heard the word hospitalized and felt it land in her chest. He escalated from intimidation to violence, she said. The timeline fits. He feels the official channels are compromised. He can't use the badge cleanly anymore because of the federal review flag, so he uses Burkett. And Burkett's people do what exactly? Tonight? I don't know specifically, Ethan said, but the pattern suggests property damage significant enough to force a temporary closure, combined with an implicit message that reopening will be worse. Possibly a direct confrontation if anyone's present who shouldn't be. She absorbed this. Her hands were flat on the bar, and she noticed they were completely steady, which surprised her, and then she thought about 12 years of emergency room nursing and decided it didn't. "What's your plan?" she said. He looked at her directly. "I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours. "I do trust you. That's why I need to know the plan." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The 3 calls I made this morning, the first was to a contact at NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Not through official channels, through a back channel that's been active for some time. I told him we expect an incident today or tomorrow and gave him the documentation package. He has enough to move if there's a triggering event." "You said that before, a triggering event." "Tonight may be it," he said. "If Burkett's people act against this property and it's documented, not just by us, but in a way that the right authorities can receive and process, then the federal inquiry converts from preliminary to active." "And the second call?" "A former colleague who lives 40 minutes from here. He's going to be in the area this evening." She waited. He didn't elaborate. "The third call," she said. Ethan looked at the memorial wall. "The third call was to the number on the card I gave you." She felt something go through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief. "I thought you said that was a last resort." "It is," he said. "This is the last resort." The afternoon was the hardest part. The bar was closed and quiet in a way it never was during operating hours. The silence having a different texture than the silence after closing. Not the comfortable emptiness of a space that had just been used and was resting, but the taut stillness of a space that was waiting. Megan reorganized the supply room because it needed doing and because standing still wasn't an option. Ethan sat in the back office with the door half open and did things on his phone that she didn't ask about. Around 2 in the afternoon, a car she didn't recognize pulled into the lot, and she felt her whole body go rigid until Ethan appeared beside her and said, "That's Sorensen. He's with me." And the man who got out was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with a veteran's posture and the easy movements of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space he needed and no more. Ethan introduced them briefly. Sorensen shook her hand and said, "Nice to meet you, Meg." And she noticed he called her Meg immediately, which meant Ethan had told him things about her, and she found she didn't mind that. Sorensen and Ethan talked in the back office for 20 minutes while Megan made sandwiches because her body needed something to do that had a clear completion state. When they came back out, Ethan ate half a sandwich standing up, and Sorensen ate his in 4 large bites, and Megan ate hers in small, methodical pieces because her stomach was uncertain, but she needed the calories. "What's his background?" she asked Ethan, meaning Sorensen, and Sorensen answered before Ethan could. "Same as his," he said. "More or less. We did 2 deployments together, and then I went in a different direction." He said it without drama, as a simple organizational fact. "What direction?" Megan said. "Consulting," Sorensen said, and smiled slightly, which told her consulting meant something specific that he wasn't going to specify. She let it go. At 4 o'clock, Ethan checked the exterior once, moving around the building's perimeter with a deliberateness that looked like a man checking for damage after a storm, and came back in and said they were clear. At 5:30, he said the same thing. At 7, he said, "Soon." And Sorensen moved to a position near the back of the bar that gave him a sight line to both doors. And Megan understood without being told to stay behind the bar and keep her phone in her hand. At 7:49, a truck pulled into the lot. Then a second one. Set. She heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of heavy tires on wet gravel, the engines cutting in sequence. Ethan had turned the bar lights down to their minimum setting, the kind of low illumination that made the inside look closed from the outside. She watched through the front window as two men got out of the first truck and stood in the lot and looked at the building, and then the second truck doors opened and two more came out, 4 men. What Burkett had promised. They were not dressed to attract attention. Dark clothing, work boots, the generic uniform of people who didn't want to be described later with any precision. One of them was carrying something low at his side that she couldn't identify at this distance. Another had a canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked at Ethan. He was watching through the window without moving. "What are they carrying?" she said low. "Standard kit for this kind of job," he said, equally low. "Accelerant, probably, or tools, depending on what Talbert asked for." Accelerant. The word sat in her stomach like a stone. "Ethan, not yet," he said. She did not ask what she was waiting for because she understood she wouldn't get an answer that helped, and because Ethan's voice had taken on a quality she had heard only once before, the night he'd stood 2 feet from Talbert and said maybe, a kind of absolute quiet that was the opposite of uncertainty. The 4 men crossed the lot and stopped at the front door. One of them tried the handle. Locked. He tried it again, then stepped back and looked at the others. That was when Megan's phone buzzed on the bar. She picked it up. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 4 words. "Do it now, EC." She looked at Ethan. He was watching the men in the lot. Without turning his head, he said, "Use the card." She had the card in her wallet. She had moved it there from the fireproof box under her bed on Friday, operating on some instinct she hadn't consciously named. She pulled it out. A phone number, handwritten in Ethan's cramped even script. No name, no other information. She dialed. It rang once. A man's voice answered, not rushed, not formal, with the measured clarity of someone who had been waiting for this call. "Holloway?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Cole gave us the address. We've been holding at County Line. What's the status?" She looked out the window. One of the men had crouched by the front door with the canvas bag open in front of him. Another was moving toward the side of the building, toward the exterior wall where the bar's original framing was oldest and most vulnerable. "They're here," she said. 4 of them. I think they're going to set fire to the building." A brief pause. "How long have they been on the property?" 2 minutes. "Do not engage. Keep the line open." She kept the line open. Sorensen had moved. She hadn't seen him move, but he was no longer in the position he'd taken up near the back, and the back door was closed in a way that suggested it had recently been opened. Ethan was still at the window. Outside, the man with the canvas bag had something in his hand now, something flat and rectangular that caught the security light at the wrong angle, and Megan's emergency room training kicked in with the involuntary clarity it always had. Cataloging and processing, ignition device, incendiary, severe burn risk, multiple exit routes compromised if this works. And then the lot flooded with light. Not the gradual yellow of street lights warming up, but the sudden white of military-grade portable illumination, 4 of them simultaneously, from the east corner and the west corner and the 2 angles of approach. And in the light, the 4 men in the parking lot were suddenly completely visible, stopped in their positions, the canvas bag and its contents entirely exposed, and the man holding the ignition device looked like what he was. Someone caught in the act of arson on a building that housed a Federal Review target. A voice came from outside, amplified and even. "Delwick County Sheriff's Station has been notified. Federal observers are on site. Put everything down and move away from the building." It was not Sorensen's voice. Megan didn't recognize it. She looked at the card in her hand and at the phone pressed to her ear and said, to the man on the other end, "There are lights. Someone is already here." "Yes, yes," the voice said. "They've been in position since 6 this afternoon." She felt her knees do something unreliable and she put her hand on the bar to steady herself. "You were here for 2 hours and you didn't tell us?" "Cole knew," the voice said. She looked at Ethan. He hadn't moved from the window. He was watching the 4 men in the lit parking lot who had stopped moving, who were looking at the lights and at the exits from the lot and doing the calculation that all people in their position eventually had to do. How many of them there were versus how many there weren't. "Ethan," she said. He turned and looked at her. "You knew they were already out there." "Yes," he said. For 2 hours. Yes. She wanted to be angry, and she could feel the shape of the anger, but it didn't have enough oxygen to catch, because the four men outside had dropped the bag and the device and were putting their hands up, and the voice on her phone was giving coordinates to someone she couldn't hear. And the building she had poured 3 years into was still standing, and in the sudden bright white light of the lot, it looked solid and real, in a way she needed it to look right now. "Who are they?" she said. "The people outside with the lights." Ethan looked at her for a moment, and then he said carefully, "The response I mentioned. When you use that card, it doesn't bring one person." "How many people?" she said. He glanced at the window. "Enough." She stepped around the bar and walked to the window and looked. Beyond the four men with their hands up, beyond the reach of the portable lights, at the edges of the lot, and at both road approaches, vehicles were parked that she had not seen arrive. Dark, without markings. And around them, in the shadows outside the bright circle, shapes that were not standing casually the way civilians stood, but with the specific economical distribution of people who had been trained to occupy space effectively. She counted. She lost count. She tried again. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "That's not a few people." "No," he said. "It isn't." Her phone was still to her ear. The man on the other end said, "Holloway, is the interior secure?" "Yes," she said. "We need coal outside in 2 minutes." She lowered the phone and looked at Ethan. He had already picked up his jacket from the hook and was shrugging it on. 2 minutes, she said. He nodded. "Ethan." She said it the way she had started saying his name, the way that meant something real was being asked. "What are they here to do?" He straightened his jacket collar in the automatic way of a man who had worn a uniform for a long time and still remembered the habit. "They're here to make sure that what happened tonight has witnesses," he said. "Federal witnesses. In sufficient number that no county official, no sheriff, no one in Talbert's chain has any room to recharacterize what Burkett's men were doing in this parking lot." "And Talbert?" Ethan looked at her. "Talbert," he said, "is currently sitting in his house 4 miles from here, waiting for a call from Burkett that is not going to come in the way he expects." He walked to the front door and unlocked it and pushed it open, and the night air came in carrying the smell of the portable lights, that particular hot electrical smell, and beneath it something chemical from the canvas bag that had been dropped and abandoned in the middle of the lot. He stepped outside. She watched him cross the parking lot, this 61-year-old man with the bad knee and the close-cut gray hair and the lined face, and she watched the shapes at the edges of the lot register his approach, and she watched 2 of them move toward him, and she watched the way they moved toward him, not with the guarded approach of soldiers dealing with a civilian, but differently, with a particular orientation that she had seen before only when very junior staff encountered very senior staff, a posture that preceded names and credentials and processed them as given. She understood then, standing in the doorway of the healing harbor, with the light pouring out around her and the cold air in her face, that she had employed Ethan Cole for 3 years without knowing what he was, and that what he was had been patiently waiting in the same place it always waited, in the man himself, unchanged by the years and the bar work and the quiet evenings. She also understood that Roy Talbert, 4 miles away in his house, was about to find out the same thing. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she recognized this time. "Priya. Doran just called me. He's hearing things on the scanner. Something's happening. Are you okay?" She typed back, "I'm okay. I'll call you in an hour." Then she looked back at the parking lot, where Ethan was talking to 2 people whose faces she couldn't see clearly, and at the 4 men from Burkett's crew sitting on the ground against one of the trucks in a posture that left no ambiguity about their status, and at the vehicles parked at the edges of the lot that were more numerous than she'd initially thought. Somewhere in the county, Roy Talbert's phone was ringing. She didn't know yet what he would hear when he picked it up, but she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had spent the evening watching a plan unfold that had been built longer and deeper than she'd understood, that whatever Talbert heard was going to change the geography of everything he thought he controlled. What she didn't know was that Talbert, when his phone rang, would not answer it, because at the precise moment it started ringing, he had opened his front door to find 2 federal agents standing on his porch with credentials and a very specific set of questions, and the phone ringing in his pocket was Burkett, and Burkett was the last call he would receive as a free man for a very long time. The two federal agents on Roy Talbert's porch were named Vasquez and Oren, and they had been waiting there for 11 minutes before he opened the door, which told them something about the kind of man he was. The kind who checked through the side window first, who assessed exits before engaging, who had learned from years of doing to others what was now being done to him exactly how much time you had between the knock and the point of no return. He opened the door and looked at their credentials, and his face did something complicated. "Deputy Talbert," Vasquez said. She was compact and precise and held her badge the way people hold things they don't need to perform with. "We have some questions about the county's business licensing operations over the past 3 years. We'd like to do this inside if you're willing, or we can schedule a formal interview at the field office tomorrow morning." Talbert looked past them at the street. One vehicle at the curb, dark, unmarked, the engine off. "How many of you are there, Barrow?" he said. "Tonight? Just the two of us." She paused. "It's a preliminary conversation." He let them in, because refusing would tell them more than answering would, and he was still in that moment operating on the belief that he could manage this. He had managed things before. He had managed complaints and audits and one prior federal inquiry that had gone nowhere because the witness recanted and the documentation was thin. What he did not know yet, what he would not know for another 40 minutes, was that the documentation was no longer thin. Megan found out about the arrest through Doran Weiss at 6:15 the next morning, which was Monday, which was the day Talbert had given her as a deadline. Doran called her, not texted, which meant it was significant. He said he had a contact at the county sheriff's department, a dispatcher named Lotte, who had been feeding him information about Talbert's activities for 2 months, because Lotte had watched what Talbert did to her cousin's restaurant and had decided she was done staying quiet. Lotte had called Doran at 5:45 to say that Talbert had been taken into federal custody at 11:17 the previous evening, that 2 of his senior deputies had been suspended pending investigation, and that the county sheriff himself had issued a statement at 4 in the morning saying the department was cooperating fully with federal authorities. Megan sat on the edge of her bed and listened to Doran tell her this, and felt something move through her body that she couldn't fully identify. Relief wasn't the right word, because relief implied the danger had been proportionate to what she'd feared. And it hadn't been. It had been worse, and the thing she was feeling was more complicated than relief. It was the particular disorientation of a weight being removed that you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. She said, "Is Ethan okay?" Doran paused. "I don't know where Ethan is." She called Ethan. No answer. She texted. No response for 22 minutes, and then a single line. "I'm fine. Bar opens today. I'll be in by noon." She opened the bar at 10. By 10:45, there were people inside who had not called ahead, who had simply shown up because word traveled in Delwick the way it always had. Through the dispatcher network, and the hospital break room, and the veteran community center, and the phone calls between people who had been waiting for something to change without quite believing it would. Priya was there by 11. Gracia Odom, whom Megan had met only once in a brief and careful conversation in the parking lot of a Millhaven coffee shop, walked in at 11:30 and sat at the bar and ordered coffee and said quietly, "I heard." "Yes," Megan said. "I should have come forward sooner." "You came forward when you could." Gracia looked at her coffee. She was a tall woman in her late 40s with the specific composure of someone who ran a business in conditions that required constant vigilance. "My lawyer says the federal review encompasses the credential audits they ran on my employees, that those 2 women may get their certifications reinstated." Megan set a hand briefly on the bar near Gracia's and then removed it. "That's good news." "It should have been prevented," Gracia said. 2 years of their lives disrupted because I couldn't—" She stopped, started again. "I couldn't find a way to fight it alone." Tiberius Lark came in at noon and sat 3 stools down from Gracia and ordered nothing and said, to the bar in general, "I signed his agreement. I need to know if that's going to be held against me." "I don't know yet," Megan said honestly. "But the investigators know the agreement was coerced. That matters." He nodded once, slowly, with the look of a man doing the ongoing arithmetic of a bad decision and its consequences. Ethan arrived at 12:20 with his jacket still on and a coffee from the Fenwick diner because he hadn't wanted to wait for the bar machine to warm up. He came through the back, hung his jacket, put his apron on, and came out to find the bar half full with people who weren't there for drinks. He He looked at the room. The room looked at him. Doran said from his usual stool, "You want to tell us what you actually did last night?" "I made some calls," Ethan said, and went behind the bar and started the coffee machine. "Ethan," Megan said it from the end of the bar where she was standing, "people here deserve more than that." He looked at her. Then he looked at the room. Priya, Gracia, Doran, Lark, 7 or 8 others he recognized as regulars, people who had sat in this bar through the weeks of Talbert's pressure and kept coming back, which was its own kind of statement. He poured himself a coffee and set both hands on the bar and said, "What do you want to know?" What he told them took 40 minutes and was not, Megan noticed, complete. He described his background in broad strokes: Navy, medical, operations, the kind of service record that involved going places that weren't on official itineraries and doing things that weren't in the press releases. He said he had left active service 12 years ago and had spent the years since doing exactly what it looked like he'd been doing, which was running a bar and staying out of the way, except that he had maintained certain contacts because you didn't build those connections and then simply delete them, and that those contacts had proven useful. He did not name the contacts. He did not describe the specific nature of his service record. He acknowledged the NCIS connection in the same way he acknowledged the weather, as a fact present in the conversation that he wasn't going to elaborate on. What he did say, clearly and without the measured evasion he usually applied to his own history, was this: Talbert had been doing this for 11 years. He had a system. The system worked because the people he targeted were isolated from each other and because the mechanisms that should have stopped him were either compromised or too slow. Breaking a system like that isn't a single action. It requires building a counterstructure piece by piece until the counterstructure is stronger. Doran said, "And you've done that kind of thing before." "Yes," Ethan said. "Where?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "Places I can't tell you about." Doran nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He picked up his coffee cup and said, "All right." And that was apparently enough for him. Gracia Odom looked at Ethan for a long moment and then said, "The women whose credentials were revoked. You said the review encompasses that." "It does. I made sure the credential audit was included in the documentation package I sent to NCIS. "How did you know about it?" "Priya told me," he said. 3 weeks ago, in a closing conversation she thought I wasn't fully listening to. Priya made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I'm going to start assuming you're always listening." "That would save everyone time," he said. The federal investigators arrived at the Healing Harbor at 2 in the afternoon, not the 2 agents who had gone to Talbert's house the previous night, but 3 others, including a woman named Haskins, who led the session with the organized efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to know that the most important thing was getting people on record before they started second-guessing themselves. She interviewed Megan first, in the back office with the door closed, for an hour and 15 minutes. Megan had her documentation file, printed and organized in the order Ethan had suggested weeks ago, and she walked Haskins through it without gaps or embellishment, dates and exact language, and the specific progression of escalation. And Haskins asked follow-up questions that told Megan the investigator had already seen some of this material, that the documentation package Ethan had sent had preceded her. At one point, Haskins set her pen down and said, "You kept records through all of this." "I was told to," Megan said. "By Cole?" "Yes." Haskins picked her pen back up. "He gave you good advice." After Megan came Gracia, then Lark, then Doran. Ethan was interviewed last and longest, 2 hours and 20 minutes, and when he came out he looked tired in a way that was different from the operational tiredness of the previous night. Flatter, more depleted, the particular exhaustion of having explained yourself thoroughly. Megan brought him a coffee without being asked, and he accepted it without comment, and they stood at the end of the bar in the quiet that the bar had between the afternoon lull and the evening rush. "How bad is it?" she said. "For Talbert?" He considered. "The arson attempt last night is the triggering charge. Combined with the extortion documentation across 8 businesses, the coerced agreements, the credential audit targeting, it becomes a RICO pattern. Racketeering, extortion, abuse of official authority." He paused. "His deputies who participated in the fake inspections are in a separate situation. Some of them may cooperate." "And Burkett?" "Burkett was arrested this morning in Mill Haven. 3 of the 4 men from last night are talking. The 4th is a problem, but not a significant one." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the front window, she could see the parking lot in its ordinary afternoon state. 2 cars, a delivery truck making a drop at the diner across the street. The strip of sky above the ridge going the particular pale gold of a late autumn afternoon. "What happens to you?" she said. He looked at his coffee. "Nothing," he said. "I'm a bartender who made some calls." "Ethan." "That's the accurate description," he said. "From an evidentiary standpoint, the contacts I used are going to stay exactly as described. Contacts. Nobody benefits from making my history the story." "Is that something you arranged?" "It's something that was understood," he said. She thought about this. The specific grammar of it was understood. The passive voice that was not evasion, but a description of how things worked in the world he'd come from, where things were not agreed explicitly, but simply known by the people who needed to know them. "The letter on your kitchen table," she said. She had been holding that back for 2 hours. "The envelope with my name on it." He looked at her. "I didn't read it," she said. You mentioned making 3 calls, and then Sorensen came, and I realized you had arranged for Sorensen to be there in case the situation went differently than it did, and that the letter was in case you weren't in a position to—" "It covered operational information," he said, which was not what she'd asked. "Who to contact, what to say, how to hand the documentation to the right people if I wasn't available to do it." "Is that all it covered?" He looked at his coffee again. "Mostly." She let that go because some things were the shape of themselves and didn't need to be pressed into a different shape. By 4 o'clock, the news had broken publicly. The Delaware County Sheriff's Department issued a statement confirming the arrest of Deputy Roy Talbert on federal charges and the administrative suspension of 3 additional officers pending investigation. It was 14 sentences long and carefully bureaucratic and said almost nothing, which was how institutional statements worked. But it was public and it was real, and it spread through Delaware in the specific way that long overdue news spreads, not with the speed of gossip, but with the weight of something that people had been waiting for without fully admitting they were waiting. The Healing Harbor was full by 5:30. Not the usual crowd, or not only the usual crowd. People Megan didn't recognize came in, some of them business owners she knew by name but not by face, some of them from the surrounding county, some of them from Hartwell Regional, which had apparently circulated something through its internal channels that morning about the investigation's scope. Percival, the auto repair shop owner who had signed Talbert's agreement and stopped sleeping well afterward, came in at 6 and sat at the bar and ordered a beer and looked at it for a while and then looked at Megan and said, "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner." "You had your reasons," she said. "I had fear," he said. "It's not the same thing as a reason." She didn't argue because he wasn't wrong, but she said, "You're here now." He drank his beer slowly and stayed until closing. The evening was loud in a way the Healing Harbor rarely got loud. Not drunk loud, but the specific volume of a room full of people who had been holding something compressed for a long time and could now let it expand. Megan moved through it and felt it, and tried not to let herself get too far ahead of what had actually happened versus what still needed to happen. Because she had been an emergency room nurse long enough to know that the moment you decided the crisis was over was usually the moment the next thing arrived. She was thinking this when Haskins found her at the end of the bar at 8:30 and said, "We need a few more minutes, if you have them." They went to the back office again. Haskins sat and looked at her notes and then looked at Megan and said, "The financial records we pulled from the county licensing office today go back 9 years. Talbert's arrangement was more extensive than what you documented. 14 businesses in total, over 4 counties." Megan absorbed this. "Some of the business owners in the expanded scope don't know yet that they're part of the investigation," Haskins continued. "We're going to need additional witnesses. Your documentation, and the way it was structured, is going to serve as the evidentiary template for the broader case." "Ethan structured it," Megan said. "I know." Haskins paused. "Cole's background, what we know of it, makes the structuring understandable. He knew exactly what investigators needed and exactly how to present it. He's not going to talk about his background." "No," Haskins agreed. "He's been very clear about that." Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional respect that was close to it. "What I can tell you is that without the documentation package he provided, last night's operation would have taken 3 more weeks to authorize. 3 weeks in which Talbert could have done significant additional damage. She paused. The bar would probably not be standing. Megan sat with that. You're telling me this because, she started, because you deserve to know the actual scope of what was prevented, Haskins said. Not the procedural version, the real one. After Haskins left, Megan sat in the back office for a few minutes by herself. The noise from the bar came through the wall in waves, the specific frequency of a room that was finding its way back to something. And she thought about the months of citations and visits, and the night the display case was kicked open and the photograph placed on the floor. And she thought about Tiberius Lark not sleeping well, and Gracia Odom's employees losing their certifications over paperwork technicalities, and 14 businesses over 4 counties in 9 years, and the particular arithmetic of sustained institutional abuse, how it accumulated silently in the ledgers of people's lives in ways that never appeared in any public accounting. She straightened up and went back out to the bar. Ethan was behind it, doing what he always did, moving in the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had learned to be exactly where he needed to be and nowhere else. She watched him for a moment and thought about the letter on his kitchen table and the 3 calls before dawn and the 12 years of quiet that had contained something she still didn't have complete language for. Doran caught her eye from his stool and gave her a small nod. She returned it. The following morning, the county newspaper ran a front-page story with a photograph of the sheriff's department statement tacked to the public notice board outside the county building, and the story named Talbert and the charges, and referenced a multi-year investigation involving federal authorities and local business witnesses. Megan was quoted once, a single sentence she had said to a reporter she hadn't fully registered speaking to the previous evening. We refused to be shut down, and we kept records, and we trusted the right people. She read it and thought the sentence was accurate enough to stand. What the newspaper story didn't include, because Haskins had been precise about what could be released, was the detail that the financial trail in Talbert's county records connected not only to the operating agreements with local businesses, but to 3 county contracts awarded without competitive bidding to companies that shared a registered agent with a Shell LLC that held a lease on a property in Whitmore County that Talbert had used for purposes the federal filing described only as ongoing criminal enterprise. Ethan read the newspaper story at the bar before opening and said nothing. At 10:30, a woman named Dahlia Ferris came in. She was 43, a home care nurse from the Whitmore County side of the county line, and she sat at the bar and looked at Megan and said, I heard about what happened here, about how you built the case. She had a file folder in her hands, the kind of folder that had been handled many times, edges soft with use. Talbert's people came for a colleague of mine in Whitmore. Same pattern, same agreement. She set the folder on the bar. I've been keeping records for 8 months, she said. I didn't know who to give them to. Megan looked at the folder. Then she looked at Ethan. He was already reaching for his phone. By Thursday, the scope of the federal investigation had expanded formally to include Whitmore County, and 2 additional county officials had been placed on administrative leave. Talbert remained in federal custody without bail, a condition his attorney was fighting and losing. Burkett had entered a cooperation agreement that the federal filing described as substantial, which was the specific legal word that meant he was giving them everything. The 3 suspended deputies retained lawyers and said nothing publicly, which was itself information, the kind of silence that preceded cooperation or indicated someone had been told not to cooperate, and the federal investigators were running both scenarios simultaneously. Percival's auto repair shop received a letter from the county licensing office advising that the violations cited in his compliance record from the previous 14 months were under review and that his license renewal would be processed without the outstanding flags pending the completion of that review. He brought the letter to the Healing Harbor on Thursday evening and set it on the bar and looked at it with an expression Megan recognized. The expression of a person who has been told something is fixed without being told how much it cost. Is this real? He said. Yes, Megan said. What do I do with it? Keep it, she said. And if anyone official asks you about it, tell them exactly what happened. The agreement you signed, the pressure that preceded it, everything. He folded the letter along its original crease and put it in his chest pocket. He looked at the bar, at the memorial wall, at the rebuilt display case with the flag and medals correctly positioned. Who did all this? He said. He wasn't asking rhetorically. He genuinely didn't know where to direct it. Megan thought about the answer. She thought about Ethan's 3 phone calls at 5 in the morning, and Sorensen arriving with a half-eaten sandwich and easy movements, and the portable lights flooding the parking lot, and the shapes at the edges of the lot that weren't standing the way civilians stood, and the card in her wallet with the handwritten number that had rung once. People who were already here, she said. People who had been here a long time. Percival nodded, slowly, as if this was an answer he could work with. He ordered a beer and sat and didn't leave until closing, and that, Megan thought, was also an answer. The kind that didn't need words, the kind that showed up and stayed. On Friday morning at 8:45, Megan arrived at the bar to find Ethan already there, which was not unusual, and a man she didn't recognize sitting across from him at the corner table, which was. The man was in his 60s, lean, with the posture that Megan had started being able to read. The particular vertical alignment of someone who had spent years in circumstances where physical carelessness had consequences. He wore civilian clothes, but wore them the way Sorensen wore them, as a considered choice rather than a default. He had a coffee in front of him that looked untouched. Ethan looked up when she came in. "Megan," he said, "this is Rear Admiral Declan Marsh, retired." The man stood, which she hadn't expected, and offered his hand, which she took. "Ms. Holloway," he said. His voice was measured and direct. "I've been following what's happened here this week with some interest." She looked at Ethan. Ethan's expression told her nothing, which meant this was planned. "How much interest?" she said. Marsh sat back down and she sat across from him, and Ethan remained standing behind her, which she noticed and filed. "Cole served under my command twice," Marsh said. "A long time ago. When he told me 3 months ago that he had a situation developing in Delwick County, I told him to call me before he did anything he couldn't undo." He paused. "He called me Sunday morning, before he called NCIS. She thought about the first of the 3 calls. 4 minutes. "What did he tell you?" she said. "He told me everything," Marsh said, "including things he probably shouldn't have told me because I'm retired and technically outside the relevant chain." He looked at his untouched coffee. "He also told me something about this place, this bar, that I wanted to see for myself." "What did he tell you about the bar?" Marsh glanced up at the memorial wall, at the display case and the flag, and the photographs. He looked at it for a moment in a way that was not performative. "He said it was the kind of place worth protecting," Marsh said, "that the people here had chosen to be useful to others at personal cost, and that someone had decided to punish them for it, and that he wasn't going to let that happen without using every tool he still had access to." She was quiet. "I'm not here officially," Marsh said. "I want to be clear about that. What I'm here to tell you is that certain things are going to happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The federal charges against Talbert will be publicly formalized in a way that names the specific businesses targeted and the methods used. Your documentation will be cited as central to the case's structure. You will probably be contacted by journalists and possibly by county officials attempting to, as they say, get ahead of the story. How do I handle that?" "Carefully," he said, "with a lawyer present. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because the system generates pressure on people who've been central to exposing it, and that pressure finds unexpected angles." She thought about this. "Is this why you're here? To warn me?" Marsh looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. "Partly. The other part is more straightforward." He reached into his jacket and set a business card on the table. "When the formal charges are filed, there's going to be a public accounting. It will include a statement about the role of civilian witnesses in the investigation. I have some influence over how that statement is worded. I wanted to know from you directly how you want this bar described." She looked at the card. Then she looked at Ethan, still standing behind her. "How do I want it described?" she said. "What it is," Marsh said. "Not what it became because of this week, what it already was." She sat with this for a long moment and thought about what the Healing Harbor was. Not the story version, not the version that would be useful in a federal statement, but the actual thing, which was a place where people who had spent themselves in the service of others could come and sit and let the pressure out slowly, where the names on the wall meant something specific to the people who looked at them, where Doran sat on his usual stool and Priya stayed to help close, and Gracia Odom had finally walked through the door. "Tell them it was a bar," she said, "that served the people it was supposed to serve, and that when someone tried to take that away, the people it served didn't let it happen." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "That's what I'll say," he said. He stood and picked up his untouched coffee and finally drank from it, which was somehow the most human thing he'd done since she'd sat down. And then he set it down and said, "Cole, thank you." Ethan said, "Thank you, sir." Marsh left. The door closed behind him. The bar was quiet in the morning light. The memorial wall lit with the small warm lights Megan kept on every day without exception. She turned to look at Ethan. He was already behind the bar picking up a cloth, beginning the morning routine that started the same way every day, regardless of what had preceded it. "Ethan," she said. "Yes. Is there anything else I don't know?" He folded the cloth and set it down and looked at her with the pale gray eyes. "There's one thing," he said. "Haskins called me this morning before you arrived. The financial records from the county contracts. The Shell LLC, the Whitmore County connection. They traced it to a holding company with 3 registered directors. And? Talbert was one of them," Ethan said. "The second was Burkett." She waited. "The third," he said, "is the sitting county sheriff." The county sheriff's name was Hartwell Grieg, and he had held the office for 16 years, which was long enough that most people in Delaware County had stopped thinking of him as a person who had chosen the job and started thinking of him as a fixture. The way you thought of the county courthouse or the bridge on Route 9. Things that had simply always been there and would continue to be. Megan learned this the way she had learned most things about Delwick's power structure, gradually and from angles she hadn't expected. She stood in the bar that Friday morning after Marsh left and after Ethan told her about the third director of the Shell LLC, and she felt the shape of it settle into her understanding like a keystone dropping into place. Not surprising, exactly. The Federal Review's reach had been expanding all week in ways that made more sense now, but clarifying in the specific way that ugly things clarify when you finally see their full dimensions. "Grieg," she said. "Yes." He issued the statement Monday morning, saying the department was cooperating fully. "Yes," Ethan said. While he was a registered director of a company connected to the criminal enterprise, Haskins described it as an attempt to position himself as cooperative before the financial records were processed, Ethan said. It didn't work. The records were already in federal hands by the time the statement went out. He just didn't know that. She thought about 16 years. She thought about the businesses that had closed on Grover Street, the ones Priya had mentioned early on, and about the texture of Delwick's public life during that time. The sense that certain things didn't get challenged, that certain complaints went nowhere, that the county had a particular weight to it that people learned to carry without asking where it came from. "How long until it becomes public?" she said. "Haskins didn't give me a specific timeline," Ethan said, "but the administrative leave process requires notification before it becomes official. Grieg will know before the public does, which means the window between his knowing and the announcement is the most volatile period." "Volatile how?" Ethan looked at her steadily. "People in his position sometimes try to control the narrative, contact journalists, prepare a statement framing the financial connection as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. Occasionally they approach witnesses. The word witnesses landed with its full weight. "Should I be worried?" she said. "I think you should be careful," he said, "which is different. Grieg is not Talbert. He's a political operator, not someone who calls Burkett." "You hope." "I think," he said, and the distinction was precise enough that she accepted it. She spent that Friday the way she had spent every day that week, keeping the bar running, staying visible, keeping her phone charged, and her records current. Priya came in for the lunch shift, and Megan told her about Grieg and watched her absorb it with the particular stillness of someone who had already suspected something but hadn't wanted to name it. 16 years, Priya said. "Yes. And the department was cooperating with the Federal Review because the sheriff told them to cooperate." She paused, while he was trying to figure out whether the financial records had surfaced. "Apparently." Priya picked up a glass and held it to the light and checked it for spots and set it down. A motion so habitual it had no real content except the need to be doing something. "I want to be angry at myself for not seeing it sooner." "Don't," Megan said. "You saw Talbert. You came forward. You brought Gracia in. That's what you had the information to do." "It doesn't feel like enough." "It was exactly enough," Megan said, and meant it in a way that was not consolation but accounting. Hartwell Grieg was placed on administrative suspension the following Tuesday, 9 days after Talbert's arrest. The federal filing that accompanied the suspension was 23 pages and was not vague. It named the Shell LLC, its 3 directors, the specific county contracts awarded through it, the mechanism by which Talbert's enforcement activities had protected the LLC's interests in the county, and the role of the Whitmore County property in what the filing called a sustained pattern of coordinated public corruption spanning 11 years. The announcement was made at a press conference held by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Regional Federal Building, which was 40 miles from Delwick in the city of Caldworth, and which Megan attended with a lawyer named Britta Solano, who had contacted her through Haskins and who had the organized, unhurried manner of someone who had spent years in rooms where high-stakes things were said and had learned to hear them clearly. Megan sat in the 3rd row and watched the federal prosecutor read the charges into a room full of journalists and cameras and the specific energy of institutional accountability finally happening, which felt less triumphant than she had expected and more like the moment when a long illness finally breaks into a fever that can be treated. Not the end of difficulty, but the beginning of the kind of difficulty that had a resolution. Talbert's name was read aloud with all 7 charges. Grieg's name followed with 4. Burkett's cooperation was described without his name being given, which was standard. The prosecutor spoke for 12 minutes and took questions for 8 and was precise throughout, the language of the filing translated into something reporters could use without losing its accuracy. Someone asked about the civilian witnesses who had built the documentary case. The prosecutor said, "The evidence structure in this case was built by local business owners who maintained detailed records under sustained pressure over an extended period. Their willingness to document and report was directly responsible for the federal inquiry's timeline and scope. Without that civilian documentation, this case would have taken significantly longer to reach this point, and the harm caused to the communities involved would have been proportionally greater." She didn't name anyone. Megan had asked Britta Solano beforehand whether her name would be used, and Solano had confirmed it wouldn't be, that the witness protection considerations meant identities were kept out of public statements while the charges were active. Sitting in that 3rd row listening to the prosecutor describe the structure of the case, detailed records, sustained pressure, documentary evidence, Megan thought about the file she had built on Ethan's instruction, the pages of dates and exact language and photocopied citations, and she thought about all the nights she had written down what Talbert said with the particular focus of someone who didn't yet know if it would matter, doing it anyway because Ethan had told her to, and because some part of her understood that the only power she had in that situation was accuracy. She thought, that is what it looked like. Not dramatic, not fast, accurate and patient and willing to keep going. On the drive back to Delwick, Britta Solano said, "You held up well." "I didn't do anything." "You sat in that room while they described what was done to you and the people around you, and you didn't look away," Solano said. "That counts." Megan looked out the passenger window at the county routes going by, the gas stations and the farm supply, and the particular winter flatness of the landscape in the late afternoon. "What happens next?" she said. "The charges proceed. Talbert's attorney will negotiate or it goes to trial, which could take 8 to 14 months. Grieg's situation may resolve faster because his cooperation value is higher." Solano glanced at her. "For you practically. The federal review flag on your license is removed effective this week. Any outstanding county citations connected to Talbert's enforcement activities are dismissed as part of the fraud remediation. I'll have written confirmation to you by Friday." Megan was quiet for a moment. "The other businesses," she said, "the ones in Whitmore County, Dahlia Ferris's colleague." "They're now formally part of the case," Solano said. "The remediation applies across all identified victims. It's going to be a process. There's paperwork, there's timeline, but the framework is in place." She sat with this. Framework in place. Not fixed, not resolved, but structured, which was the necessary precondition for resolution, and it was more than they'd had 3 weeks ago. Ethan was behind the bar when she came in that evening, and the bar was full, and she stood inside the door for a moment before anyone noticed she was there and looked at the room. Doran at his usual stool, Priya moving between tables with her precise economy of motion, Gracia Odom in the back booth for the 3rd time this week, which had become something like a pattern, the veteran group from the community center occupying their usual cluster near the window, 2 nurses from Hartwell Regional who had started coming in since the news broke and who Megan didn't know yet but was beginning to. She thought, this is what it was supposed to be. Not the version without difficulty. The version that had come through difficulty and was still here. Ethan saw her and poured a coffee without being asked and set it at the end of the bar where she always stood. And she came around and picked it up and told him briefly what the press conference had looked like and what the prosecutor had said, and he listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "And Grieg?" "His attorney contacted the federal office this afternoon," she said. "Britta told me on the way back. He's cooperating." Ethan nodded once. "Does that make you feel anything?" she said. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "It makes me feel like it's the predictable outcome of the evidence," he said. "Whether I feel anything about that specifically, I don't think I'm the right person to have feelings about Grieg. I didn't know him personally. What I knew was the system he helped build." She thought about that. The system, not the man. The pattern, not the incident. "You've always seen it that way," she said. "The system, not the person." "It's easier to be accurate about systems," he said. "People are harder. They have explanations for themselves." She drank her coffee and looked at the room and said, "I want to do something for the businesses that were affected. Not just here, the Whitmore County people, Gracia's employees, everyone. I don't know what yet." "You have time to figure it out," he said. "I want your help." He looked at her. "You have it." Yeah. The weeks that followed were neither triumphant nor simple, which was accurate to how things actually worked when institutions were being held accountable. There were delays and procedural steps and moments where the machinery of justice moved at a pace that felt insulting relative to the pace at which the harm had happened. Megan learned to sit with that, the same way she'd learned to sit with a lot of things. Not by suppressing the impatience, but by giving it somewhere specific to go. She started meeting with the other business owners formally, twice a month at the Healing Harbor, on Wednesday evenings before opening. It was not a support group in the therapeutic sense, more like a working group. People comparing notes on where their documentation stood and what they'd heard from Solano and what the county's remediation process actually required of them versus what it claimed to require. Tiberius Lark came every time and said almost nothing but kept coming, which she understood as the particular way some people stayed connected while they processed. Gracia Odom became the group's de facto note-taker because she had the most organized mind in the room, which Megan thought was funny, given that Gracia had initially been the hardest to bring to the table. Dahlia Ferris drove in from Whitmore County for the third meeting and brought 2 colleagues, and after that the Whitmore County contingent was a permanent presence, and the group grew to 14 people and then to 20. Not because Megan had organized it intentionally, but because the need for it existed and she had provided the structure. Ethan attended every meeting and spoke rarely, and when he spoke the room listened, which she noticed without commenting on. Grieg entered a formal cooperation agreement in the 6th week. The terms were not made fully public, but Solano told Megan that the agreement included complete disclosure of the LLC's activities, the identities of everyone in the county government who had facilitated or knowingly enabled Talbert's operations, and the transfer of all financial records related to the shell company to federal custody. In exchange, Grieg's federal charges were reduced from 4 to 2, with a sentencing recommendation that his attorney had negotiated. He resigned from the sheriff's office the same day the agreement was signed. There was no press conference. The resignation was a single paragraph posted to the county website at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and Megan read it on her phone while standing at the supply room entrance and felt, again, that complicated thing that wasn't quite satisfaction. More like the particular silence that follows a loud sound, the moment when the absence of something becomes real. Talbert did not cooperate. His attorney went to trial, which took 11 months, and during those 11 months the case existed in the background of Delwick's daily life the way long cases always did, periodically surfacing in the local news, occasionally producing a filing that Solano would email Megan a summary of, consistently there without being resolved. Megan learned to hold it lightly, the ongoing procedural weight of it, without letting it compress everything else. The bar stayed open. That was the primary fact. Every day, every shift, the bar stayed open. Ethan told her he was leaving in the spring. He told her on a Tuesday morning, which was the quietest morning of the week, sitting at the corner table with coffee, the same position Marsh had occupied 3 months earlier. He said it straightforwardly and without preamble, which was the only way he ever said anything. "Leaving Delwick?" she said. "Leaving the bar," he said. "Delwick I haven't decided about." She sat across from him. She had known, in the background of things, that this was coming, had known it the way you know things that you don't want to examine directly, because examining them makes them real. Ethan was not someone who stayed in one place indefinitely. She had understood this without articulating it for a long time. "Why now?" she said. "Because it's finished," he said. "What I came here to do. Or what I ended up doing, which wasn't what I planned when I came." She looked at him. "What did you plan when you came?" "To stop," he said. "To run a bar and stop. That was the plan." "And instead?" He looked at his coffee. "Instead, I ran a bar and watched something happen that I knew how to address, and I addressed it. And now it's addressed, and I'm 61, and my knee hurts in the cold, and I think I've used up most of what I had left to use." "That's not true," she said. "The knee part is very true." She almost smiled. Almost. "You know what I mean." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Megan, this place doesn't need me anymore. It needed me for a specific period, to do a specific thing, and I did it. What it needs now is what it's always been. You. The way you run it. The people you've built around it." She looked at the memorial wall, the rebuilt display case, the flag refolded, the photograph in its better frame. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an actual answer." He waited. "The night you gave me the card, 18 months before any of this started, you had the card ready. You'd already thought about what you would do if something like Talbert happened." She looked at him. "Did you know something was coming? Or did you just always prepare for what could come?" He considered this for long enough that she knew he was giving it genuine thought. "Both," he said finally. "I'd seen enough of what Delaware County was to know that the kind of system Talbert was building doesn't stay small. It grows until something stops it. I didn't know when. I didn't know the specific shape of it. But I knew that the bar was the kind of target it would eventually reach, and I thought, if that happens, the response needs to already be in place." She sat with this. "You protected this place before it needed protecting," she said. "I tried to," he said. "I also made mistakes. The timing on calling Marsh could have been 2 days earlier. The documentation should have included Whitmore County from the beginning. I only found the connection to Dahlia Ferris's situation through Priya, and I should have mapped the broader network sooner." "You're telling me your mistakes." "I'm telling you it wasn't clean or perfect," he said. "It was a 61-year-old man with a bad knee and some old contacts making decisions under pressure and getting most of them right and some of them slightly wrong, and being lucky enough that the slightly wrong ones didn't cost anything irreversible." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "Don't." "I'm going to anyway." She kept her voice even. "You spent 3 years preparing to protect something you cared about without anyone knowing you cared about it. That's not nothing. That's actually a very specific kind of thing, and I'm grateful for it." He was quiet. "I'm so," she said, "going to need to hire a new bartender." He almost smiled. It went almost all the way. "I'll write a reference," he said. Wokte. Roy Talbert was convicted on 6 of the 7 federal charges on a Wednesday in late spring, 11 months and 3 weeks after his arrest. The jury deliberated for 2 days, which Solano told Megan meant the evidence was heavy enough that the deliberation was about sequencing the charges, not the facts themselves. The sentencing happened 6 weeks later. 14 years, federal, with eligibility for review after 10. Megan was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She had been, twice, for procedural hearings, and the experience of sitting in those rooms while Talbert's attorneys framed and reframed what had happened to her bar and her staff, and the 14 businesses across 2 counties, had taken something from her that she needed back, and she decided that the sentencing was the moment to take it, not by being present for the conclusion, but by choosing where she was instead. She was at the Healing Harbor. It was a Wednesday evening, which meant a moderate crowd, the specific midweek energy of people who came because they needed to, not because the weekend had given them permission. Doran was at his stool. Priya was on shift, moving with the economical rhythm that Megan had come to think of as a kind of signature. The memorial wall was lit. The rebuilt display case held its contents, the flag, the medals, the photograph in the good frame, with the permanence of things that have been restored by effort and mean more for it. Solano texted her at 4:43, 14 years federal, 6 of 7 counts, Sentencing complete. She held the phone for a moment, then she set it face down on the bar and went back to work. Doran, watching her, said nothing. He picked up his glass and held it slightly toward her, a gesture small enough that nobody else noticed, and she nodded once, and that was the ceremony. Ethan's last shift was a Friday in April, which meant the bar was full when he left, which felt right to Megan, in a way she couldn't have planned. He finished his shift the same way he had finished every shift, restocking what needed restocking, wiping what needed wiping. The closing procedures executed in the same sequence he had always followed, with no drama and no deviation. The regulars knew he was leaving. The bar's version of a farewell was subtle by the standards of other places. People staying a little later than usual, conversations running a little longer, Doran ordering a second drink that he nursed for an hour without appearing to drink. Priya gave him a card that the staff had signed, and he read it in the back and came out with his face doing the thing it sometimes did, where the control was visible as the thing it was. Gracia Odom was there. She had become a genuine regular now, Wednesday evenings and occasional Fridays, and she sat in the corner booth and raised her glass to him from across the room, and he raised his in return, and that was the entirety of it, and it was enough. At the end of the night, after the last customer left and the door was locked and the lights were at their minimum setting, Megan and Ethan stood at the bar in the quiet, and she poured 2 glasses of the whiskey she kept on the high shelf for specific occasions, and they drank them standing up, which felt correct. Not a sit-down kind of moment, a standing moment, the kind where the walls remember what they've been through. "Where are you going?" she said. "I haven't decided," he said. "Somewhere with a mild winter." "You deserve that." "I deserve a knee that works," he said. "We don't always get what we deserve." She looked at him. "Some of us do. Eventually." He looked at the memorial wall, at the photograph in the better frame. He held his glass without drinking for a moment, and she watched his face do the private arithmetic that it always did, the calculation she had never been allowed to see the full contents of and probably never would be. "This was a good thing to protect," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." He finished his glass, set it on the bar with the particular finality of a last action, picked up his jacket and his keys, and walked out the back door the same way he had walked out after every shift for 3 years, with no ceremony and no backward glance. She stood in the bar alone for a moment, in the quiet, in the light from the memorial wall. Then she washed the 2 glasses, dried them, and put them back on the shelf. In the months that followed, the Healing Harbor became something slightly different from what it had been, not in the way that places change when they're rebuilt from scratch, but in the way that places change when they've been through something and come out the other side with the same bones and different weight. The Wednesday business meetings continued. The Whitmore County group became its own chapter of something that didn't have a formal name yet, but that Megan and Gracia were in the process of building, a network of small business owners in the medical and veteran-adjacent sector who shared documentation practices and knew which lawyers to call and had an understanding, informal but real, that if something like Talbert's system started forming anywhere in their counties, they would see it earlier and move on it faster. It was not a perfect solution to a structural problem. Megan had no illusions about that. The structure that had allowed Talbert and Grieg to operate for 11 years was an institutional failure that required institutional repair. And institutional repair moved at the pace of institutions, which was slow and uneven and often frustrating. What the network could do was not prevent corruption from forming. Nothing individual prevented that, but reduce the isolation that allowed it to compound undetected, which was where most of the damage actually lived. She thought about this one evening in late autumn, closing alone, the staff gone, the bar quiet. She was wiping down the shelves behind the bar, the same motion she had always used when she needed to think. And she thought about the 11 months of the Talbert case and the 16 years of Grieg's tenure and the 2 businesses that had closed on Grover Street and Gracia's employees and the women in Whitmore County and all the small, specific, undramatic harms that had accumulated in the ledger of a system nobody had been positioned to see whole. She thought about what Ethan had said. It wasn't clean or perfect. She thought about the mistakes he had named and the ones she had made, the weeks when she had almost stopped keeping records, the night she had almost signed the agreement just to make it stop. She thought about Tiberius Lark not sleeping well, and Percival with his letter from the licensing office, reading it with the expression of a man accounting for a bad decision. She thought, Nobody in this story was brave all the time. The bravery was in doing the specific thing when it was needed, not in being fearless before it arrived. That was the thing she had learned, or relearned, or learned in a form she could finally keep. Courage was not a state. It was an action, repeatedly chosen, under conditions that made not choosing it very understandable. The people who ended up on the right side of things were not the people who had never been afraid. They were the people who had been afraid and kept the records anyway, who had come to the table eventually even when it wasn't safe yet, who had stayed at the bar and the parking lot lights and not run, who had given an old bartender a key 12 years before they understood what he was. New plaque appeared on the memorial wall in November. Megan had commissioned it herself, from a woodworker in Millhaven, and she had written the text herself after 3 drafts that were wrong in different ways. The final version was short. It said, "For everyone who chose not to stay silent, you know who you are?" It wasn't Ethan's language. It wasn't the language of official recognition or institutional acknowledgement. It was hers, which was the point. She hung it herself, on a Tuesday evening before opening, with a hammer and 2 nails, slightly crooked on the first try, corrected on the second. A week later, she got a text from an unknown number. 3 words, "Good placement, EC." She looked at the text for a moment, and then she texted back, "Need any better?" The response took 4 minutes. Mild winter helps. She set her phone on the bar and looked at the memorial wall, at all the names and faces and unit patches and the new plaque hanging slightly to the right of center, because that was where the wall space was, and that was where she had put it, not perfectly positioned, just there, which was how most good things ended up in the world. Not in the ideal location, not under ideal conditions, but present, visible, in the place where the need was. She opened the bar. The lights came on. The door unlocked. The first customers of the evening came through. Doran, early as always, and behind him 2 nurses she now knew by name, and behind them a woman she didn't recognize yet, who was looking around at the room with the particular expression of someone who had heard about this place and needed to see if it was what they'd been told. Megan came around the bar and said, "Welcome. What can I get you?" The woman looked at the memorial wall. Then she looked at Megan. "I just moved here," she said. "Someone told me this was the right place to come." "It is," Megan said. And it was. Not because everything had been resolved without cost, not because the system had fixed itself, not because the right people had won cleanly and without remainder, but because the people here had refused to be made smaller by a man who believed that power was the same thing as authority, and they had been proven correct, and they were still here, and the door was open. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.